Hi, my name is Beth Massi, and today I'm going to show you how to deploy a Visual Studio LightSwitch application. LightSwitch is a new development tool for building business applications for the desktop and the cloud. LightSwitch makes it easy to create data-centric, rich Internet Silverlight applications. I already have an application open that we've been building in this video series. It's a simple order management system that allows us to work with customers and their orders. Now I want to deploy this application so that other people can start using it. We have a few different options for deploying this app, but before I jump in on how to exactly publish this, let's go over some of the options that we have. The first option is a simple two-tier desktop application. This means that all the users' computers are running Windows on the same network or workgroup and will make a direct connection to the database. Each computer will have all the pieces of the application, client and server components, and the setup program will check that the .NET framework is installed. In this case, we're usually looking at a handful of users connecting to the database so that the database machine can even be another client. Another option is three-tier deployment. This means that we still have clients and a database, but now we will also host the LightSwitch application services on a web server in Internet Information Services, or IIS. Clients can access the web server over a wider area network or the Internet, depending on how you want to set up access to the web server. This also means that the client machines only have a small application to download and run, which uses the very small Silverlight framework, making deployment to clients much easier. There are two types of client applications you can host with this setup. You can choose to host the client as a Windows desktop application, or you can choose to host it as a web or browser-based application. If you deploy the client application as a desktop application, then it can only be deployed to Windows clients. But the advantage is that the application is installed into the Start menu with an icon, and you can access users' local documents folder as well as other applications running on the machine. This option also supports calling COM objects, like in the case of working with Microsoft Office. If you choose to host a web browser application, then clients can be Windows or Mac users, and all they do is navigate their favorite browser to the web server to access the application. This provides the ability to serve more than just Windows clients, but it also limits what you can do in your application a little bit, meaning no access to COM objects like the Office applications and no access to the local file system. In both of these cases, nothing is installed on the client except for a small Silverlight 4 runtime. Finally, another option is hosting the application services in Windows Azure and the database in SQL Azure. You still have the same client deployment options here, but in this case we don't have to have our own web or database servers on premises. We can deploy directly to the cloud. I'll show how we can deploy to Azure in the next video. For now, let's just focus on 2- and 3-tier on-premise deployment. So first, let's deploy a 2-tier application. I want the database to live on a database server that I have. The client components will include all the LightSwitch components, and they will connect to the database directly with a connection string. There are two ways clients can access a database on your network. One way is by using their Windows credentials, otherwise known as integrated security. And another way is by specifying a SQL Server username and password. If you allow all your users to connect via integrated security, then you would need to maintain all the users' access on the database. If you only have a few users, then this can work. However, if you have more than a handful of users, in this type of 2-tier deployment, it's usually better to use a SQL Server username and password. This makes all the connection strings the same and means that you can take advantage of connection pooling. However, keep in mind that if you want to change the login, then you will have to update all the connection strings on all your users' machines. So before we actually get to the publish wizard inside of LightSwitch, we're going to need to make sure that we can access our SQL Server. So I'm here on the database machine, and I have this set up with SQL Server Express. We just need to make it accessible on the network. So first I'm going to open up SQL Configuration Manager. And what we'll need to do is we need to enable the browser service so that our SQL Server can be found on the network. So here's the SQL Server browser, just right click on that, and if you don't see any of these enabled where you can start it, go into Properties, okay, go to the service and make sure that the start mode is set something other than disabled, okay. Then go ahead and hit apply, and then you can click start. Okay, so this will make it so that we can address our SQL Server from on the network. Okay, so the next thing we're going to need to do is we need to enable at least the named pipes in the client protocols. So I'm going to go into this network SQL Server network configuration protocols for SQL Express, and I'm just going to enable named pipes. Okay, and then I'm also going to make sure that the client here, client protocol, is also enabled. It should be already. Okay, so after I do that, I need to make sure to go back up here to the SQL Server service and restart it. Okay, there we go. All right, so the next thing we're going to need to make sure is that SQL Server authentication is enabled so that we can specify a SQL Server username and password into the database in our connection strings. Okay, so we can do that by opening up SQL Server Management Studio, which is installed when you install SQL Server Express with tools. And what we'll be able to do is just verify that the database security is set up in mixed mode. So what we do is we can just go into right here into the instance. You can right click, go to properties, go to this security section, and just make sure that it says SQL Server and Windows authentication mode. So that's our server authentication is clicked. If you change it, you'll need to also restart the service. Okay, so mine's already set up to accept username and password, SQL Server username and passwords. Okay, so now let's go back to LightSwitch. And now what we can do is we can go ahead and double click on properties and go to the application type tab here that I've got selected, and we can just click this publish button, and we will verify the client and server configuration through these steps. So what I want to do is I want to deploy this as a two-tier app as a desktop client. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select desktop. We'll do web in the next when we do the next one. Okay, so the second step is the application server configuration, and this is where I'm going to specify local, meaning I'm going to run the application services on the same machine as the client. Okay, so this avoids the need for the web server. Okay, so the third step is where do we want to put the publish output? So what LightSwitch is going to do is create a setup exe for us that users can then click on to install the entire application. So where do I want to put those files? And by default, it's usually specified somewhere under your project folder. Okay, I've run through this once before, so I've changed it. What you want to do is actually change it to something like this, where you have a UNC share that you can go ahead and point users to. So I've created just a shared folder on my server called publish, and that's where I'm going to put those files. Next, you can specify whether or not you want to just create a script to install and configure the database, or whether you want to publish directly. So I'm going to publish the database directly. All right, so next we have to specify two different connection strings. The first connection string is for the administrator, meaning me right now, because I want to publish this database directly. And this is the connection string that will be used to create that database. Okay, and so by default, it's set up with integrated security equals to true. Okay, meaning it's going to use my Windows credentials to do that. Now, if you do have an administrative, sysadmin, SQL Server username and password in there, you could go ahead and specify that too. All right, the second connection string is the more important one here, because this is the connection string that the application uses to connect to the database. Okay, so this is the user's connection string. So what we want to do is we want to create a new database login here. I'll just go ahead and name it LS user, and you're going to need a strong username and or a strong password. So let's see. Okay, so it's got to be at least 8 characters long, and it's got to have, letters, numbers, and symbols. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create that user. And that actually just went ahead and created that login in the database for us. All right, so next, this application, it actually does use Windows authentication. I'm going to need to go ahead and deploy the application administrator into the database. Okay, so that's just going to be me. By default, I will be the application administrator, and that will mean that I can access the users and roles. So if you watched the previous video, I walked through security and how that works. And so this is basically just deploying that user into the database, that application administrator. All right, next, if we had added any additional components to our application, we might need to specify additional prerequisites to install. By default, the .NET Framework 4 and the Windows installer is checked, and that's all we're going to need. Okay, so go ahead and click Next. All right, finally, we can specify a certificate. Now, this is going to, the two-tier application is going to create what's called a click once application. And so what that means is if we sign the application here with a certificate, then we can go ahead and trust the trust prompt won't come up. So when I install this application, you're going to see, are you sure you want to install this, because the publisher can't be verified. If you specify a certificate, then the publisher can be verified. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and in our case just leave that blank. All right, so this is just like a summary of what's going to happen, and then you just go ahead and click Publish. And so now down at the bottom, you'll see the build started, and then there's the publishing of the project is starting now. Okay, so what this is doing is it's actually creating the database schema for us on our database server, as well as creating the setup.exe and publishing those files on that UNC share. Okay, there we go. Now publish is succeeded. Okay, so now let's go ahead, and all we need to do is navigate to that publish directory. So let's see, ls server publish. Okay, so there's the share, and now you can see there's our setup.exe. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and double click on that to install the app. Okay, so here's where it will just go ahead and verify that the publisher is, you trust them. So okay, that was me, so I'll go ahead and install. And this is going to go ahead and install all of the components. The application services are now here locally, as well as the client desktop application. Okay, so once it installs, it's going to go ahead and launch. And now what we're doing is we're connecting directly to our database. Okay, so now you can see here's our administration menu, and now we can go ahead and enter roles and users into the system. Okay, so that's how we publish a two-tier application. Now, in order to uninstall this application, you're actually going to see it now here in your start menu. To uninstall it, you would go ahead to add remove programs just like normal. Add remove programs, and you'll actually see it in the list here. Mine's called order management here, and we can just go ahead and uninstall it and go ahead and remove it. All right, cool. Okay, so let's now go ahead and do a three-tier deployment. In this case, we're going to be connecting from the web server to the database via direct connection, but the clients will be connecting to a web server over the internet or a wide area network. So the authentication works like this. So we still have a connection string to specify, but it's only placed on the web server. In my case, the database is on the same machine, but it doesn't have to be. We can connect via Windows integrated security, or we can go ahead and do just like we did before and specify a SQL username and password. From the client side, we don't have a direct connection to the database, so the web server or Internet Information Services will authenticate users depending on the authentication settings we specified in our application. We can choose to have no login or no authentication, which means that IIS will allow anonymous access to the application. We can choose to use Windows authentication, which means that Windows credentials are passed to the web server, which authenticates that way. This is appropriate if you have all Windows clients and they're on the same network or corporate domain. Whatever credentials the user uses to log into Windows are passed automatically, and this is the most secure option. Finally, we can use forms authentication, meaning a username and password is supplied to access the application. This works if not all clients are on the same network or they're across the internet, and if you have a mix of Windows and Macintosh clients. So since I already showed Windows authentication with a two-tier desktop deployment, I'm going to now show forms authentication with a browser-based deployment in a three-tier. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is, since I want to show forms authentication, is I'm going to go to the Access Control tab and switch it to Forms Authentication. Okay, so next we can go ahead and click Publish. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to specify, instead of desktop, we're going to specify that this is a web browser application. Okay, so we can show what that looks like. All right, so next, because you can't run the web server deployment locally, it automatically has selected IIS server for me. Okay, and here's the IIS server has the LightSwitch deployment prerequisites installed. So let me just go to the next section here and I will show you what that means. So there's two things we can do. We can create, for publish output, we can create a package on disk, or we can remotely publish to the server directly. Now if you want to remotely publish to the server, there is a couple things you need to do on the server to set it up to do that. Okay, so let's go over to my server. And I've got this Microsoft Web Platform installer page open. Now you're going to want to go ahead and install the Microsoft Web Platform installer. Once you do that, when you go to the Products Tools section, you'll see the Visual Studio LightSwitch server prerequisites. Okay, it's called Beta 2 Server Runtime right now because I am working with Beta 2. Once we release, it will be named appropriately. But all you need to do is install this, and it will install everything you need and set up IIS appropriately so that it can host the applications, as well as set up what's called the Web Deployment Tool so that you can remotely deploy LightSwitch applications to the server. Okay, so one thing to check after you install this is just make sure, go into your services and just make sure the web deployment agent service is running. Okay, if that's not running, then it won't work. All right, so now that I've got these things set up, let's go back over to the Publish Wizard, and now you just specify where your server is. Okay, the LS server is the name of my machine, and what application or site that we want to create. It by default picks the name of your project. Okay, and then you just specify an administrator username and password. Okay, so next, database connections are going to be exactly the same as before. We need to specify an administrator connection for creating the new database, or we specify, the user connection. This is the connection that's going to be from the web server to the database itself. Okay, and I'm just going to keep those the same. Next, authentication. Where I'm going to select, yes, I need to create an application administrator at this time. Okay, and this is now Forms authentication. Now it had deployed a Windows authentication user into the database before. This is a new deployment. I say I'm creating a new application. Now I'm going to just need to specify my username. Okay, and then there's my full name, and let's just go ahead and specify a password. Okay. All right, then click Next. Okay, since this is a browser-based application, we don't need to specify a certificate to sign the ZAP file. That's just needed for desktop applications. Okay. All right, so next, and here's our summary, and now we can go ahead and publish. And now what this is doing is creating a web application on our web server. Okay, so there it's succeeded, and now all we need to do is open up a browser directly to our web server. So let's go ahead and navigate to that. Server order management. And now you'll see it needs a username and password. And once I go ahead and log in, the application opens, and now I can go ahead and add more users and roles. Okay, so that's how you can deploy a 2-tier desktop application and a 3-tier web browser application. Now keep in mind, I didn't show it, but you can still host desktop-based client applications with a web server. Okay, so there's a lot of flexible deployments. Actually, I will suggest that you go over to the Developer Center, msdn.com/lightswitch, to learn more about additional publishing options. If you go to the Learn Center, the Learn tab here, there's some information about deploying LightSwitch applications. We'll be building up more content as we go, but here's a step-by-step article how to publish to Windows Azure, as well as how, if you're say an ISP or a hoster, how to configure web servers and some of the other additional tips and tricks and information that you may need to set up deployments of LightSwitch applications. Okay, so for the LightSwitch developer, it's actually fairly easy to go ahead and publish your applications through the wizard. You just have have to use the web platform installer to set up the prerequisites on the IIS server and make sure your web deploy service is running, and you should be good to go. So in the next video, I will show you how you can host the application services and the database in Windows Azure. So thanks for watching.